Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Gray Matter. Today we have a very exciting show, I think, for you. Our guest is a person who very nearly became the first elected lady premier of our province, Danielle Smith, and her plan is to become the third. I use the term lady loosely, not in relation to her, but in there I'm including Madam Notley. Only because I'm chivalrous and I'm a gentleman. But if people think that's unfair, they should Google me and then check out her Facebook page to discover all the awful things that she said about me. I happen to regard her party and its ideas as, frankly, malevolent. But that's a topic for another show. We might ask Danielle what she thinks of that. But in any case, here we have Danielle Smith. And I'm going to do a bit of an introduction on her. Of course, she's a very accomplished person. She's well known to many Albertans, many Canadians, because she's been in the public eye, in and out for many years, more than a decade. She has been a politician previously and is re-entering politics, but she also, in between, had a very successful media career. So, as we always do, we're going to start off with a couple of aphorisms, and when she hears these, she's going to know that we've done her homework on her. The first one is from a man named Thomas Flanagan. The quotation is, "But if politics is an art, it is not like sculpture or painting, where one side acts and the other is passive material. It is more like drama without a script or dance without choreography. In other words, improvisation. Either player may surprise us again with a new move." Next one is from Preston Manning. Who once quipped, "What's the difference between a politician and a catfish? One is a wide-mouthed, bottom-feeding slime sucker, and the other's a fish." Finally, we have Mr. Dave Rubin, who said, "To have your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, you have to be tolerant of somebody else's life, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness." So, with that, we launch into a bit of an introductory biography of Danielle Smith. And this is from her own website, where she answers the question why she wants to be our next premier. She says, "I'm running because I love Alberta. This is my home, and I feel passionately that the people of this province are not being treated fairly by Ottawa. We need to push back, regain our pride, and have autonomy over our decisions. Together, let's put Alberta first, and as premier, that is exactly what I will do." Danielle describes herself as a proud Albertan. She is a University of Calgary graduate with degrees in economics and English. We share the English degree. Danielle has had a lifelong interest in Alberta public policy and finding the right balance between free enterprise, individual freedom, and the role of government. She was a member of the Legislative Assembly for Highwood, leader of the official opposition, and leader of the Wildrose Party. Before re-entering politics, Danielle had extensive experience in the media and in business. Most recently, she was president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. And before that, she was a radio host with Chorus Entertainment for 6 years. She is married to her husband, David, and in 2006, and together they own and operate the dining car. I'm going to ask her about that. That sounds really good. This is a fully renovated 1940s Railcar dining car, and she's the proud stepmother of David's son, Jonathan. Danielle and David live in High River with their 2 dogs, Kane and Colt. What kind of dogs?
Well, it's a Chesapeake Bay Retriever.
Oh, wow.
So he's a bigger dog, but he's delightful. He is. And then the other one is a Labradoodle who just he's like the welcome wagon when we go out. He has to meet every other dog out there. But one is now 14 and the other is 9. So they're getting up there in years, but they've just been constant companions through a lot of up and down. And it's amazing to have them. Dogs are they're therapy, right? Like they love you no matter what you've done, no matter what kind
unconditional
of day
love.
had.
Yes.
Totally.
Yes, indeed.
I love it.
Well, thanks for being on the program today. It's really great to have you on and to learn more about you and also you and your politics and why you think that you're the best person to lead our province. Before we get into some topics that I know you want to talk about, we did this little biography, which I borrowed from your own website, but I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your own background. I read that you're from a family of 5 children. We have that in common as well. and that you grew up in Alberta in the 80s and 90s, Ukrainian girl. And so you could tell us a little bit about that and school days and things like that, and also your time at U of C, how and why you became involved in politics, or just to give people a sense of who you are, where you're from, maybe at the layer beneath the politician.
That is a long answer. You probably saw me rocking it out to George Michael, though, when you were.
Oh,
you were
yeah,
like,
see,
I'm a girl
yes,
of the 80s. I was a Duran Duran fan, so just know that I've been to 2
They're
Duran
wonderful
Duran.
too. They're wonderful too.
There you are.
Yes.
When they come again, you and I'll have to go to the concert. And I noticed when you said you got an English degree, I went back for economics, you went back for law, because I realized my English degree qualified me to continue serving in restaurants, which I loved doing. But I knew I needed to probably, if I wanted to get on the policy track, I needed to have economics as a bit of a grounding. So when I finished, I got into, as you mentioned, I have 4 siblings, which have just been a great joy to me. We all, my sister lives in Ponoka, and she's got a couple of kids. My brother, Troy, lives up in Grand Prairie. He's got a couple of stepkids and a new grandbaby. My youngest brother, Shane, he's the vegan environmental activist who it's interesting to have somebody who's kind of my polar opposite in my family, because we have just some wonderful, robust conversations. But he's been important to me because he's really, I think, helped to shape my thinking around how we approach people who have different views than we do. I mean, I love him, and we don't agree on everything, but we have really great conversations. He now lives in the UK with his wife. And my older brother, Doug, he's also got 3 kids, and he's just been sometimes my protector, sometimes my antagonist. You know how older brothers can be. Maybe you are that older brother, but
younger.
There you go. So you know what it's like to have an older brother who says the only one allowed to pick on her is me. So he's been a great protector of mine over the years too. But I initially thought after my English degree that I wanted to be an actress. So I went to Vancouver to be in the acting business, and it was boring as heck. And so I found it interesting, the quote that you raised with Tom Flanagan, because politics is kind of the counter of that. It's kind of a pseudo celebrity world with a pseudo acting and pseudo improvisation to it. And so you still have
our prime minister has somewhat proven your point.
Isn't that the truth? I mean, he maybe should go back to the drama side of things, and I will stay firmly on the politics side of things. But it is true. It is a bit of a dance, and it is improvisation, and it has a lot of elements of speech, and you have to be a good communicator. And that's what really appealed to me. So if you look at my career, it really goes in cycles, where I started in public policy with the Fraser Institute, and then came here to do business advocacy with a group called the Canadian Property Rights Research Institute, which was a landowner rights group. So I've been familiar with all the great work that our ranchers do in stewarding our landscapes for a lot of years. And that gave me sort of firm grounding in that sector of our economy, which is increasingly important as we talk about food security. Then I got elected to the school board. So, and then after I got fired from the school board, you'll see that this is a bit of a trend too. I joined the Calgary Herald as an editorial writer. So when I left that, went back into politics, got fired from politics, and then went back into the media with Chorus Entertainment. And then after I left the media, I went into business advocacy again. So I've had sort of 3 careers in business advocacy, 3 careers in media, and only 2 careers in politics. That's why I feel like things happen in 3s. So this will be 3rd time lucky, or 3rd time accept the lesson that the universe is trying to tell you. Because the first time getting fired from the school board, second time got fired from the PC members who didn't want me to be their candidate. So I am hoping that I've made enough amends for the mistakes of the past. Certainly have a long experience now, 27 years of analyzing public policy, mostly from an Alberta perspective. I joke that I literally have an opinion on everything. So be careful what you ask me, because this could be a 3-hour conversation. But that's been where I've been. I can tell you more about the Railcar too, if you're interested.
Yes, would you tell us about that?
Well, the nice thing about having, when I leave politics, I really leave politics. I go do other things, because I think that's what a lot of politicians don't have, is they become career politicians, and then they get dome disease, and they don't end up talking to real people. So when it was about 2017. There's this beautiful dining car that was established in 47 on the CN line. And then it was repurposed in 1965 as a dining car to be able to support Expo in Montreal. It tootled around on the lines until 89. Then it was retired and came here. And so it's been sitting here since 89. It had a couple of cafes to start, and then it was operating continuously as a restaurant since 93. And the volunteers did a beautiful job initially of putting it together, but it was falling into disrepair. And my husband and I knew if we didn't step in and save it, no one else would. So we stepped in and saved it. And it's just a glorious little place. It, when I get to work there, I'm normally doing dishes, but sometimes my husband will let me go out front if I don't talk politics. But I do all of the regulatory compliance and bookkeeping and tips and payroll for the company to support my husband in that. But it has really been a bit of a sanctuary for us, and just such a great way to talk to people and find out what's really on their minds. So, and it is my first career. My first career was in service. So I did 7 years in the restaurant business. So it's nice to have gotten back to it.
Well, I certainly hope that your political career is also one of service, because what we've had, unfortunately, in governance has looked more like mastery than service.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me like that is the way that you were oriented. But
you know, and it really is. And because when I moved to High River, I should just tell you the story, because one of our business leaders in town, Dr. Ron Gorche, is about to retire, and he's just done some amazing work in building up a Charles Clark Center and really establishing High River as a place where seniors can feel comfortable getting all the care that they need close to home. But one of the things that happened when I first moved out here is I got involved in the Rotary Club. And it was time to do the art gala. And there was Doc Gorche lined up with his little tuxedo serving canapes to the room. And I just thought, you know, like that is truly what keeps you humble, keeps you grounded, is that you never feel like any job or any volunteer position is beneath you. And so that is, I'm glad to see that is an ethic that I see in business, and I wish I saw more of that ethic in politics. I hope I can bring a bit of that to it, because I firmly believe that you do have to stay grounded and really be in touch with what regular folks are feeling. I walked in lockstep with everyone during these past few years in COVID, because I was seeing it on the front line, seeing it with my staff, seeing it with my customers, up and down, open, close, arbitrary rules. So I don't know that very many politicians had that experience, that same experience, and maybe that's why I'm so angry about what happened over the last couple of years. I want to make sure it never happens again.
Well, that's an auspicious start to the conversation. So let's get into learning a little bit more about your ideas, maybe delve into some of the things that are most important to you. In the opening, we mentioned Thomas Flanagan and Preston Manning. Could you describe how those people have influenced your political philosophy?
Completely. I'll add Ralph Klein to it, interestingly, as well, because when I started getting involved in politics in 92, 93, I was the president of the campus club for the Progressive Conservatives. And I'm so glad I got involved in politics at that time, too, because we had a common political club's office. So Ezra Levant was there with the Reform Party, and Rob Anders as well. He also went on to get elected. But Naheed Nenshi was there. He was the head of the Political Science Association, and the Liberals were in the office, and the NDs were in the office. And so that, to me, was the way you have a healthy political debate, is that you have friends who are from all sides, and then you just have a conversation about all of those topics. I've been pleased to be able to do that all of my career. It's just these last couple of years where cancel culture has stepped in to stamp out political views that I think we've ended up with a real problem. But one of the things I loved about Preston Manning and Tom Flanagan and their philosophy was the notion that you do have to have a representative representing their people, that grassroots politics means something, in that the MLA or the MP has to be able to first, you represent the view of the party when you run under a particular banner, and so clearly there'll be some policies that you share in common. But issues always emerge over the course of being elected, and then you have to make a choice of, do you follow your personal conscience, or do you follow the will of your constituents? And I think if you've got an MLA or MP who matches the views of their riding and the culture of their riding, I think that those don't need to be in conflict. But I've always felt like the MLA works for the people who elected them, that it's up to the leader and their cabinet to persuade their colleagues that they're going in the right direction. And this is why I bring Klein in, because Klein always had the view that if you can't convince your colleagues in caucus that a piece of legislation should pass, you can't bring it into the legislature. And he would make his ministers go through 3 rounds to make sure that the legislation they were putting forward had broad-based buy-in. Because let's face it, if even your own colleagues in your own party banner don't support something you're doing, then the guys on the other side aren't, and the general public probably isn't either. And I think we've lost both of those. We've eroded the role of the MLA, and we've eroded that collaborative approach to passing legislation. Those are 2 things that I would want to bring back. And of course, Tom Flanagan was a professor of mine. I had to take a statistics course, and the economics one wasn't available, but his class in poli-sci was an equivalent. And he has been so key in shaping my career. He gave me a recommendation to go work at the Fraser Institute as an intern. And then, of course, he was my campaign manager in 2012. And I think he's just done some brilliant work on First Nations in helping to expose some of the impoverished conditions and helping to chart a path for how we can improve their economic outcomes, which I think now in Alberta is really beginning to bear fruit. So I think that all of those men had just a huge, enormous influence on Alberta and on my political thinking too.
Terrific. I want to talk a bit more about both of these 2 gentlemen a bit later, but before we go there, I'm going to ask you, I guess, maybe the obvious question, that is, what made you decide to step away from a very successful media career and re-enter politics?
You probably know the answer to that, because you've been on the receiving end of poking away against the official narrative, and you see the vitriol that comes back at you. Something strange happened to the media in the last year. I used to have quite a lot of latitude to cover issues from all perspectives, and that was a bit of my brand, is that I would bring on people from a variety of different views, a lot of different experts, sometimes conflicting views. And I often have in the call-in section, my listeners say, but you just brought on an expert yesterday who said the opposite, because I wanted to train them into thinking, just because somebody has letters behind their name and says that they're an expert doesn't mean that they're right. And this is the whole process that we go through when we're trying to figure out what's true, is we hear a thesis and a counter thesis, and then we see where the common ground is, and then it forms a new thesis. And then we have to actually decide for ourselves with our own critical thinking ability what's true. Well, that's got short-circuited in the last couple of years. And so what I observed happen in the media is there's either one of 2 things that occurred. I think Sundar Pichai from Alphabet, the parent company of Google and YouTube, was at least the most honest about it. He basically said straight up, I'm not going to put anything out there that contradicts Dr. Anthony Fauci. That once Dr. Anthony Fauci has issued some edict, no one was allowed to question him. And I think this comes under the realm, they classified this as misinformation. And that's a sort of a frightening place to be in, where essentially one person's word becomes the gospel truth, especially since that one person kept on changing his mind multiple times throughout the course of the pandemic as well. But I think that gives you an idea of what happened, is that at least the Google boss was being honest about what was going on. And the media here just followed in the same step, is that if anything contradicted Dr. Theresa Tam or anything contradicted Dr. Dina Hinshaw, I think that they were thinking that it would erode public confidence in health orders if they offered up any alternative perspective. So they clamped down on it, and they weren't allowing it to be reported. And that's just wasn't my style. I just felt like, number one, it's not accurate, fair, balanced journalism, which is what I was trained in. And number 2, I worried it was killing people. And that is why I couldn't sleep at night. I mean, I found out about some of the early therapeutics right from the very beginning, but wasn't allowed to talk about them. And then as the therapeutics started progressing, as we were getting more evidence, then they started issuing letters from colleges that you weren't allowed to prescribe it, and doctors were getting their licenses pulled. There's now probably about 20 different generic cheap drugs that have shown to have some kind of benefit in reducing hospitalization, and no one's allowed to even name them. So we're still not through the problem on that. But when Dr. Peter McCullough gave his testimony in the Texas Senate and said we could have saved 85% of these people from dying if we had just been giving them the drugs that were available. That's the kind of reason I just couldn't participate in that. I just to me, you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. And so when I left politics, I launched a lawsuit or a GoFundMe to fund a lawsuit to try to get to take on the college. And you've probably seen this too. We interviewed a lot of different docs to try to get them to do it, but everyone's terrified that the college has the ability to put a discipline letter on your file, and then you can never work here or anywhere else in the world again. And so I'm trying to find different ways that we can tackle the fact that I think that they are operating way offside with legislation, way offside with their mandate. And I think getting into politics again will be the way to make sure that we can restore that right to prescribe, restore the patient-doctor relationship, restore the right of patients to direct their own medical care, make their own choices. To me, this is now a political solution that we need to have, and that's what I want to add to the mix.
That sounds brilliant. Actually, we had Dr. J Bhattacharya on this program, and he said something similar to what you just did. When he was on, we talked a lot about truth in science and the scientific process. He described it in Newtonian terms as this conversation across time, where, as you put it, the best ideas are sort of, strongest steel forged in hottest fire, and how people like Dr. Fauci are destroying that discourse. He said something I didn't realize, and this is the power of the NIH. Dr. Bhattacharya said that a young researcher in the United States who was trying to, for example, get tenure or get their PhD, simply cannot do it unless they have an NIH grant. And guess who controls all of the NIH grants? So when Dr. Fauci says, "I am science," he's not kidding. And so this is, and of course, Dr. Bhattacharya now is, in some circles, is being touted as perhaps the next head of the CDC once the Republicans hopefully win there and restore some
oh my god, that's
coherency.
The best news I've heard all day.
He and of course you probably know he was the expert witness in the Ingram case, and touching on your point about the attitude of Dr. Hinshaw & Co. The main attack on Dr. Bhattacharya, if you can believe it, from Alberta was the same one that Dr. Fauci made, where he called Dr. Bhattacharya and then certain doctors from Harvard and Oxford as fringe epidemiologists. But they essentially attacked Dr. Bhattacharya's credibility in the sense that he was not speaking the truth because he had a political bias that was infecting his ability to report accurate science. So what you say about restoring some truth and discourse, I totally agree with you. This is something that we've lost. We've lost it in politics too, haven't we, in this country? Where we can't really talk. We can't risk offending anybody anymore. That's a serious problem, isn't it?
It's totally true. The problem that I've been sort of struggling with over the last number of years, and I think I've got a solution on most areas, is that wonderful if Dr. J Bhattacharya becomes the head of CDC, but then the guys on the other side can just appoint a new head of CDC, and you actually get culture change in an organization. And so I've been watching this since I was on the school board in '98, and over the years, it didn't seem to matter who got elected at the trustees or who was appointed. The culture persisted. So I've been applying this idea of, I call it Uberfying. We need to Uberfy government services and government structures in the way that Uber dismantled and challenged the traditional taxi oligopolies, and Airbnb tackled and challenged the existing hotel oligopoly, and Expedia challenged the traditional travel industry. There's a similar application where if you apply free enterprise principles to government, give the dollars to the individual, whether it's a patient or a student or a parent, and allow for local decision making. So rather than having only one decision maker up here, have 100 or 1,000 different decision makers down here. Then you create a market for choice and competition, and the best ideas will always rise to the top. And I think the problem that we have in everything is that we've just hired a bunch of central planners, and then conservatives come in and they think they can just hire better central planners. But the problem is, this is the reason why we're polarizing and going back and forth between two different worldviews. Whereas I think if you were to change the system we were talking about, there has to be a way for us to honor the individual expertise of a doctor. This is why I say that the college is operating offside. You probably read the Nebraska Attorney General's decision, where he went through 48 pages, and his conclusion was, well, as long as it's been approved, a drug approved by the central agency, I guess here it'd be Health Canada, and you're not overprescribing it in a massive dose, and you've told the patient, and there's no contraindication, you should be allowed to prescribe that drug. We do off-label prescriptions all the time. So I feel like you've got someone, and I'd love to find out who that was, interfering with the legislation that we have in place. And that to me is a real problem. So how do we get back to allowing individual doctors to have the autonomy they always felt that they had? How do you change the funding structure that you were talking about so that a multitude of doctors are able to access the funding that they need, so that we have a multitude of opinions? I haven't cracked that nut. I'm not quite sure how to Uberify medical research yet, but you've planted a seed with me about where the problem is, and I promise you, next time we talk, I'll have a solution.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you want there to be a next time. I want to ask you a little bit about since we've sort of been skirting around the issue of COVID. I want to go into that in more detail, but before we go there, I just want to play a clip of you and then ask you a couple of questions about it. So Devin, could you play that clip now?
Premier has done a great job, I think, representing Alberta internationally on our energy file. I don't have a big beef with a lot of what he's done, but I think that there were a couple of things that he didn't meet expectations of members that have plagued him for the last year. One, I think, was on the issue of vaccine passports and vaccine restrictions. He stood tall and strong and said he'd never do it, and then he flipped. And I think that caused a lot of people to question what would happen if we go into the next respiratory virus season. So I think there was a loss of trust there. But more importantly, I think there's this sense that there's, on a lot of files, Ottawa is running the show. And although the Premier's done a great job, I think, of challenging things in the courts, I think there was a bit more of an expectation that with Quebec announcing that it was going to be a nation within a nation, and Saskatchewan doing the same, that they wanted to see the Premier take a stronger stance in telling Ottawa to stay in its own lane, especially with the result that came out last week in the Alberta Court of Appeal, where Bill C-69 clearly tramples all over provincial rights. And I think that's going to feature prominently in this leadership campaign.
Okay, so a couple of things about that. I think that the things where you express support for Premier Kenney, I think, resound with most of the people who supported him. And I think they would give the same check mark to him that you did. But I'm more interested in talking about this response to first of all, response to COVID, how to deal with, respiratory emergencies or pandemics. And also this issue of what is Alberta's role in confederation going forward, because it seems to me that they're somewhat connected. And we talked a little bit just off camera before we started. You described it as the architecture that was really constructed by the Kenney government within the Public Health Act, that, as you know, I spend a lot of time dealing with in court. But really what they've done, what the Kenney government did, is they amended the Public Health Act to make it possible for a non-elected bureaucrat to really act as a medical dictator. And that is what we had we still have today. And as you aptly put it, this architecture is still there. So that's question number one. If you became the next premier of our province, would you retain that architecture, as tempting as that would be in terms of consolidating your political power, or would you remove that and replace it with something that would meet the needs that you would see in terms of public health, but also, prevent or be a bulwark against the types of invasions of violations of liberties that you talked about in that clip.
So you probably know Lieutenant Colonel David Redman. And,
oh yes, he was also a witness in the.
Of course.
Yeah, I hold him in high esteem. I think he's just a brilliant man.
So he's traveled the world and he's got his vaccinations because he's gone into some pretty dangerous places that have a lot of rare diseases. And he's had to get at various vaccinations. And he showed me that he has this little yellow immunization booklet that used to be what you would use to demonstrate your vaccine status. And it was issued by the federal government, and it was maintained by the federal government. And so why it is that we switched to having the province now be the servant of the federal government in collecting all of this data for travel purposes, that was an error. And now how do we undo it? That is the real challenge, right? Because I would hazard a guess that maybe 90% of Albertans have one of these QR codes that allows them to travel. Maybe it's lower than that. So if you were to just get in and dismantle the system, now 100% of Albertans wouldn't be allowed to travel, because the federal government is still enforcing vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. So they've created a real problem for a successor government. My view is that we always should have gone down the same track as other European nations. Like, I should be clear, like I don't think that we should be having a QR code that tracks our medical information available to every Tom, Dick, or Harry who asks for it. Medical information used to be private, and it should be private. And we should go back to this idea of data sovereignty. If we were to actually structure a medical ID appropriately, then sure, I'd get a QR code, but I would control the passport access to it. I would be able to control who gets to see what on my file. I would take it into my physiotherapist and say, okay, yes, you can see that. And yes, you can add your information. I would take it to Alberta Health Services and say, yes, you can see it. Yes, you can add information. So I believe, just so you understand, that I think medical information in digital form it's either going to be shared one way or the other. Either AHS owns it and can share it with whoever they want, or you own it and you get to share it with who you want. And I would go to the latter. Now, how do we get there from here? So the second part of this issue is, I've always felt like natural immunity should be recognized just as well as vaccination, because other nations in the world did this. I believe it was in Europe, you could get a QR code whether you had a vaccination or whether you had natural immunity. Why didn't we do that here? That would have solved the lion's share of the problem, because now that we've had the Delta wave and Omicron wave and whatever this last wave was, virtually everyone I know who is unvaccinated because they've had it once or twice. And so why don't we acknowledge that? And that would remove a lot of the social stigma and division. The other folks who don't want to get vaccinated are people who got one jab and had a serious injury or adverse effect as a result. And I'm astonished that the medical profession is not recognizing that and is being so stingy in writing up medical exemptions. And then the third area is religious exemption. And I want to represent a riding of people who have very strong religious convictions, and I respect religious freedom. They should also be allowed to be exempt from it. And also, incidentally, many of them have also had COVID as well. So I think in some ways, if we create a system where we recognize the vaccine, natural immunity, medical exemptions, and religious exemptions, I think that covers the range. And we should be able to restore freedom to travel for every single Albertan. That's, I think, we have to kind of make a bit of a mockery of the federal system, because there's no justification for it now. You even have national columnists talking about how it just looks like the prime minister is being mean and vindictive because maybe he feels like he lost when he took on the Freedom Convoy and he had to back down. And so he's just clinging to rules that no longer make sense. But it's up to us to try to find a way to push it forward. And I know not everybody loves my idea, because there's a lot of people who want to see the entire system blown up. And I can understand why, because if we continue having this expectation that every new virus is going to require a new vaccine, which is going to require a QR code so that people can be denied access to restaurants and travel and gyms, then we're not very far ahead. We have to go back to where we were before, which is that, yes, we will always have viruses. There will always be, sadly, a portion of the public who are at risk of those, but lockdowns don't work. And we cannot get to this point where we think that somehow lockdowns did work. That's one of the next steps that I want to make sure that we can clearly communicate, is because I think there's a lot of politicians, and including in our own government, unfortunately, who, when they say that Ron DeSantis or Kristi Noem took the wrong approach, that what they're saying is that they believe they took the right approach and they do it again. I think Ron DeSantis and Kristi Noem took the exact right approach. And what I would love to do is a study that really drills down into why there were different death rates in different jurisdictions. Because I have a theory. My theory is that the jurisdictions that did the worst job at keeping it out of long-term care facilities probably had the worst outcomes. If you look at what happened in New York and Quebec, they were discharging COVID-positive patients into their nursing homes. No wonder they had a high death rate. They had nothing to do with keeping young people from going to bars and restaurants and gyms, and everything to do with bad government policy. We've got to expose that so that those kind of things don't happen again. And that's that. I want to get back to some honesty in how we report on these things, so that there's a lot of people, I think, who have a misapprehension of who's most at risk and why, and the kind of measures that we can take that will truly protect our most vulnerable.
Well, part of what you were just talking about, and what you also mentioned in the clip, is this concept of sovereignty. And as you know, this is something that is very topical in the country right now. Of course, Conrad Black just wrote an interesting piece about Bill 96 in Quebec, which essentially, reverses the Plains of Abraham. And so Quebec is going its own way. And as you know, there are many people in Alberta who think that this is the way to go to become more sovereign. You commented on this in that clip there about health sovereignty. As you know, health is one of the Section 92 exclusive jurisdictions provincially, but it seems as though Alberta has been taking its cues too much from the federal government. And so I'd like to ask you a little bit about what your approach would be as Premier in terms of, ensuring not only health sovereignty, but, sovereignty in a broader sense, and not getting into separation. I want to ask you about that, but just the concept of sovereignty, of running Alberta in the best interest of Albertans, not only health, but, the other things that you're interested in, like the economy, oil and gas sovereignty, the ability to get that product to market, and to, as I say, we're facing this sort of enemy of Alberta's greatest industry, oil and gas, within our own country. Our own prime minister I just don't think there's any way you can defend or deny the reality that the oil and gas industry and Alberta are under attack by our own federal government. And so I'd be interested to know from you, I think this was part of the criticism that Mr. Kenney suffered from, was that most people would say he didn't do enough to sort of keep Alberta sovereign in terms of not only health, but our economy, protection of our civil liberties, all things that I would say are within the power of the Alberta government, of our premier, and really the responsibility of our premier, because we've seen this done, as you know, with people like Ralph Klein and Premier Lougheed. We have had premiers who have been much more, let's say, vigilant or active about protecting Alberta from an abuse of federal government, which is, in my respect for you, is what we have right now. So what would you do as premier to sort of prevent the continuation of this, what appears to be persecution of Alberta and Albertans?
Yeah, and I'll bridge it to the last one, because I often ask the question, why is it that Ron DeSantis and Kristi Noem in the US were able to chart a different course, and no Alberta province charted a different course? Is it because we are so reliant on federal transfers now that we give so much to Ottawa and then we beg for a certain portion of it to come back? Is it because they collect our personal income taxes and they might forget to put the check in the mail so that we can't pay our nurses and doctors? Is it because we've gotten so indebted that when we went to float our bonds in the first summer of COVID, that nobody wanted to buy them. And so we had to beg and plead the federal government to bail us out. We've made ourselves a junior partner in confederation. And when you do that, you have no control over anything. So when you look at what happened with our equalization referendum, that was a clear line in the sand for Albertans. They said, we want equalization to end. And what was Justin Trudeau's response? He gave us Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. And he signed a 3-year deal with Jagmeet Singh so that he could continue to impose vaccine mandates. And he is now signaling he's interfering in our childcare, our dental care, our pharmaceutical care, and our long-term care. That was his answer to us. And so what's our answer to him? Well, I'll tell you what my answer would be. It would be passing the Alberta Sovereignty Act. This is a piece of legislation that Rob Anderson suggested through his Free Alberta strategy.
I just learned about this, actually.
Yes.
I met Mr. Anderson, and it's a brilliant concept.
It is a brilliant concept. Yeah. And the notion behind it is that we would just say it's almost like a notwithstanding clause against intrusive federal legislation. So if the federal government passes laws that violate our areas of jurisdiction, we just won't enforce it. And so we already have precedent. I think I interpret what happened with Bill 96 a little bit differently than Conrad Black. I think Quebec is, first of all, an international embarrassment. I mean, we try to demonstrate that Canada is an open, welcoming place, that anybody here on the basis of merit can come and be successful. And the values in Quebec are completely opposite to the values in Alberta. So don't mistake me when I say that what we can learn from their act, what I take from their act is look how far they can go in saying we want to be different. If they can go that far, and then look across at British Columbia. British Columbia just got an exemption from the criminal code so that you can possess and use fentanyl and crystal meth and cocaine without being prosecuted. I have a whole list of federal legislation that Alberta should be exempted from. First of all, the Emergencies Act. We should have done what the National Assembly in Quebec did as soon as it came into effect, saying won't apply here. They want to start freezing bank accounts? Sorry, we don't do that here. It doesn't apply here. They want to start taking firearms away from law-abiding firearms owners and handgun owners. Sorry, we would think our police should be focused on policing real crime and going after those who are stealing property in rural areas, not going after the law-abiding gun owner just because he now is guilty of a paperwork crime. We would also say, sorry, C-69, fair enough. You've got jurisdiction over pipelines and cross-border infrastructure. You can't dictate to us that we can't build highways or put up power plants or do SAG-D operations. No, it doesn't apply here. So that to me is going to be the centerpiece of pushing back. But the second part, of course, is that we do have to start repatriating our dollars because as the old comic strip adage goes, he who holds the gold makes the rules. Right now, Ottawa holds the gold. So are we surprised that they make the rules? I wonder if Albertans know the $600 billion have come out of Alberta to be spent in the rest of the country. We have this slush fund system where Ottawa overtaxes us, buys us back with a little bit of money, dictates how all of our programs should be operated, and then takes the surplus to fund programs in Quebec and Eastern Canada where they can win votes, at the same time demonizing Alberta, saying they don't want our dirty oil. This is not a system, like this is abusive. Why are we putting up with this? So I would say that we start repatriating those same services that Quebec has. We begin with personal income tax. We move on to Alberta provincial police, because if we're going to say we'll enforce in our way, with our values, so that pastors like Pastor Coates don't end up getting targeted by our CMP, we can tell them to stand down. We can tell them that that's not what we do here. Other provinces seem to have managed quite fine without throwing pastors in jail, whereas here we've thrown 3 pastors in jail. We need to be able to repatriate have a conversation about pension plan and EI, which are administered separately in Quebec. They also control their own immigration system. We need to be able to attract workers. With our growing economy, we've got huge shortages in skilled labor in the agriculture sector, in construction, in labor. We need to be able to have more direct control to attract people here and have a pathway for permanent immigration as well. Quebec does all of that. Why can't we do all of that? And I think it will actually make the country stronger, quite frankly, because the real problem that we have, all of us collectively, is Ottawa. Ottawa can't do its own areas of jurisdiction well. They're failing to meet their international commitments on national defense. They're failing on foreign aid. They're failing on managing our immigration system. They can't seem to manage the cross-border flow of illegal immigrants coming across Roxborough Road. They are failing to be able to manage airports properly. The COVID policies are creating a catastrophe in travel into Toronto Pearson Airport. They can't issue passports in a timely way. They're wrecking the value of our dollar. So they got a lot of their own business they need to take care of before they start trying to tell us who can clean our teeth and who gets paid for what. I mean, they want to meddle in our areas of jurisdiction, maybe to deflect away from the fact that they're doing their own areas of jurisdiction so poorly. So we've got to underscore that. We have to demonstrate competence. We are now a senior partner in Confederation. We've got to start acting like it. And so those would be the things that I would put front and center. Fall session, we got to move quickly on it, because there's a lot of people who've been told for a lot of years, myself included. I've been a fan of the firewall letter since it was first drafted by Stephen Harper and others in 2001. And politicians look at it, they do their consultations. Albertan says, yeah, let's go ahead. And then they always come up with some reason not to move on it. I see no reason not to move on these things. We got to move on them. We've got to move on it quickly to restore that credibility and to put Ottawa in its place, because otherwise they're just going to keep on pushing us around.
It sounds as though I agree with you that the federal system in Canada historically has worked best when the provinces are strong. And what has seemed to occur, particularly with this prime minister and his father, is an attempt to consolidate power, not only in the federal government, but in the prime minister's office. And that's clearly what's occurred. And so I like what I'm hearing from you about ways that we could change that trend. In fact, much of what you say sounds familiar to me, is much like what I've heard from a man named Josh Andrus in the Confederation Project. Mr. Anders, I met actually at an APP event, the Alberta Prosperity Project event. He was in Airdrie recently, and he was there talking about this law that you discussed, and he was very well received. But I want to talk to you about the APP because there seems to be some symmetry between what you're talking about and then some lack of symmetry. So what the APP would say is that a strong and sovereign Alberta is important, and it sounds like you could get on board with that. But they would say that someone like Dennis Modry, who was on this program, Dr. Modry, would say, well, but Confederation is broken. Canada can't be fixed, and Alberta we got the short end of the stick from the very beginning, going back to Clifford Sifton, and it's never going to change. I know you're a student of history, you know all this stuff, but the APP is saying, if we just left Ottawa, if we had the referendum, and that's something I want to ask you about. If we had the referendum and we did leave, Alberta would be the richest country in the world on a GDP basis. And that sounds awfully good. So I have two questions for you about this by way of setup. Number one, if you were elected premier, and if the will was there to do it, would you permit the referendum to occur? That's number one. And number two, I think I know the answer to this, but do you support independence for Alberta? And if not, why not?
So I haven't given up on Canada. I know a lot of people have, and because I've been to one of Dr. Modry's events too, and he asked the question, do you want to go nation within a nation like Quebec? I put up my hand, and about a smattering of others did too. And then he asked about the full question of a Clarity Act referendum, and the majority of the room did. So people have had it. And I agree with Modry to this, Dr. Modry on this point too. We can't continue operating under the original terms of Confederation. I look at it as a refederation is what we need, because when I've looked at some of the stats, Alberta is going to be the second largest economy, exceeding Quebec within the next 5 to 10 years. We were supposed to get to that point prior to COVID, but then COVID kind of derailed us. But within the next 5 to 10 years, probably sooner rather than later, we'll be the second largest economy in the country. And then if you project out just based on population, they're doing everything to destroy population growth and attractiveness to Quebec. We're doing everything to increase it. Those lines will cross at some point. And about 2050, maybe even sooner, we'll be the second most populous province in the entire country. So think about that. How can we continue to operate under a constitution that gives Quebec 24 Senate seats and gives us 6, when we're the second most populous and the second most prosperous, the second largest contributor to the country? Mm-hmm. How can we continue to have them have a guaranteed number of House of Commons seats and us get less? How would we be able to have them appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court, and us don't even have a guarantee of 1. You get 1 for all of Western Canada, especially when the Supreme Court makes so many life or death decisions over how they interpret the Constitution. We can't continue to operate. So it's very clear that we need some kind of refederation on the basis of the new reality that Quebec, or that British Columbia and Alberta are powerhouses, economic powerhouses in their own right, counterbalanced by Ontario and Quebec. It's a very different type of scenario when you're talking about 4 roughly equal partners coming together and how we support the smaller provinces than what the conversation was back in 1867, which is essentially, let's treat the colonies as a source of wealth that will be mined and exploited to send to Eastern Canada so that they can do the value added, and that will to the benefit of Eastern Canada. That's not a model that's going to work at all anymore. And so there is a constitutional reckoning coming. The question is, can we get terms that will work for Alberta? And I think we can. The other place I would say, because I've pitched the idea of us taking over more responsibility, and I must tell you, the confidence in our civil service in Alberta has been shattered because of how Alberta Health Services is run. I had one woman say, how can I be sure that they can actually collect my income tax appropriately, or manage my pension, or manage my EI when they've made such a mess of healthcare? So we have to first walk our talk. We have to demonstrate high performance in our public service, add in new capacity, add in new services so that people feel some confidence there. We have to stop treating our municipalities the way Ottawa treats us. We take a ton of money out of our municipalities in the form of education property tax that really just goes into general revenues. And then we just trickle back a portion to our municipalities based on provincial priorities. That doesn't seem to me to be a respectful relationship either. So I'm about fixing Alberta. And as we fix Alberta and assert Alberta, then I think we develop the confidence in the public that we want more and more autonomy. I don't know how far we'll go down the autonomy track, but I do know that as we start doing it, it will fundamentally change the relationship with the rest of the country. It gives us a bargaining position. As for a referendum, the legislation is there. Citizen initiative allows for people on a constitutional question to get 20% of electors. I think that right now that would be close to 600,000 people. If they sign up saying they want a referendum on the question of a Clarity Act referendum, then the legislature will be obligated to do it. So I'll be watching the petition collection, that signature collection that Dr. Modry is doing with great interest. My sense of it is that people they want to try to fix Canada first. And if that doesn't work, it might escalate to the next step. But I think for my interest, I'm trying to fix the relationship with Canada first.
And it sounds like the means by which you would do that is really the same thing that Dr. Modry is talking about, and that's this concept of leverage. So, for example, theoretically, you might, I think if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is you might support the referendum if you thought that could help Alberta in terms of getting some of its sovereignty back and redefining this relationship within confederation. Is that a fair way to put it?
If a vote was held today, I guess this is just it. I don't know that there would be enough signatures today. And I think this is going to be a question for Albertans to decide. The sense that I get is there's a lot of frustration in rural Alberta and not quite as much in Edmonton. In fact, if you look even at the equalization referendum, Edmonton went the other way on that, which is sort of baffling. What? You mean you want them to keep on taking more money than they need to be giving it to Quebec? I'm sort of astonished that it.
Well, I
that
wanted
it
to
failed
ask you
there.
about that reminds me of something else I want to ask you about, but finish your point.
But also in Calgary, this is the difference that I've noticed is that I've been following the sovereignty movement for some time. The last time it rose to about a 25% support rate was when Ezra Levant was running the Western Standard, and he did a poll on it just before Stephen Harper won. And I think it was about 25% support. But the difference this time is that it's downtown office building guys, the guys who have big money, big investments, they're the ones who are now saying that the relationship with Ottawa has become untenable. And so when you've got people who are investing a big amount of dollars who are prepared to take on the political uncertainty of us asserting ourselves more, that's new territory. So Ottawa really needs to take note of that Albertans really have had enough. And I don't think that they get it at all. I think that they have seen that they have pushed and pushed and pushed, and we never push back. And so they keep on pushing further. So let's push back and see what happens. That's where I'm at right now. As I said, I think Canada and our relationship with Canada could be fixed. I recognize there are not others who can agree, but I think we can work with every group who wants to push for more autonomy, more assertion of our own rights, because I think that that's going to be the first step regardless.
Okay. Speaking of pushback, so today we have big L Liberal mayors in Calgary and Edmonton. The Edmonton mayor is, I would describe him as a failed Trudeau cabinet minister. So it would seem to me, if and when you become our next premier, based on what I've heard from you today, which hasn't shocked me, your politics would be somewhat misaligned with what these two mayors are saying. How are you gonna deal with that?
I have to accept that Alberta, that Calgary and Edmonton, they elected probably the most progressive councils that I've ever seen. I don't think Calgary's had a conservative council since Rod Sykes back in the 60s and early 70s. And so maybe that's just what Albertans want. Maybe they want some places have a different culture where if you look at Ontario, it's often said that if they vote in Liberals at the federal level, they want to counterbalance it with PCs at the provincial level and vice versa. Maybe what happens in this province is because we reliably send conservatives federally and provincially, that the place for that people want a more progressive voice is at the municipal level, which wouldn't surprise me, because when I think of where I get the greatest value for my tax dollar, where you give money to that order of government and then you actually get something for it, it's the municipal level. I get my sewage treatment, my water treatment, I get my lawns mowed in the parks, I get the roads paved, there's buildings that are built for recreational facilities. You can actually see what your money does. So I think that there's high value in making sure that our municipalities are well funded. And so I don't know that I'm all that much offside with where the two large city mayors would be. Here's where I have some sensitivity to where they're at. I think Jody Gondak has said that there's $170 million more that leaves Calgary to go into general revenues that then comes back in transfers. So we're doing to Calgary exactly what Ottawa does to us. And why would we do that? If we're going to be consistent, what we should do is sit down with Mayor Gondak and say, okay, well, how can we work over a 3-year plan to make sure all those dollars stay here? But in return, we want to make sure that you address the unfairness that we have on business taxes, because that's what's really driving businesses out of Calgary, is this huge additional charge that they have to pay. And let's streamline the business building permit process, because I've been told by many that it's being used as a revenue generator. If you get more revenue, can we streamline that building permit process so people can get their businesses up and running faster? I think there's a way to have that negotiation. The other thing that we need to recognize with our two big cities is that as they get large, they take on some of the additional services that would normally be provided by the provincial government. I mean, the homeless crisis and the healthcare associated with that, those really are provincial issues. And it is up to the local policing to try to manage that. Maybe that should be the first call on Alberta provincial police. Maybe we need to set up a system where we train our Alberta provincial police to respond to mental health calls like the San Antonio police do. And they could come in as a backup when somebody is harming themselves or others because of their addiction. And there have been places around the world where they put individuals into treatment jails so they can get clean while they're serving their time. And then at the other end, you have social supports where when they are released, you make sure that they don't go right back to the same lifestyle. Rhode Island has a really good program like this that I learned about in the documentary Seattle is Dying. So I think we have to stop fighting with Calgary and Edmonton, realize they are a little bit different, and then try to find a way to support them with the extra burden that they have of services that they have to provide just by nature of being a large city. So I don't think it's insurmountable. Again, this is what happens when you're on talk radio for 6 years, is that you always try to find the areas where you can agree, and there will probably be areas where we disagree. But I'm finding that I'm very sensitive to the fact that we are underfunding our cities, and I'll tell you the exact number on it. We initially developed a transfer program when we were only taking $1.2 billion in education property tax that came in through Ed Stelmach. And if only at that time we had allowed for a plan that they would keep all the education property taxes, because now it's up to 2.4 billion. And if we don't correct this, give it another 15 years and it'll be up to 4.8 billion. And I would ask anyone if they actually think that taking those extra billions and giving them to Alberta Health Services is somehow going to result in better outcomes than just allowing each of our municipalities keep those monies, those dollars for interchanges and all the things that municipalities have to pay for. So we need to change that relationship too. I think there's an answer there as well.
It sounds like building compromise and finding common ground is one of your strengths. For example, I should
mention, I have a professor who used to say, I hate compromise. It means that both sides lose. And which I always found hilarious.
Both sides win too.
But I think both sides win. Yeah. Exactly. As long as you agree, like maybe you'll disagree on 90% of the things, but if you can find those 10% of the things that you can move forward together on, because you know what happens is when you find some area that you can work together and have a positive outcome for everyone, then it just creates the goodwill to say, now maybe I should see if there's another area that we can work towards common ground on. Right. I would love to have a world where politics just works so well that people can get back to their regular lives. Politicians have interfered with our lives so much over the last 2 years.
Amen.
I think people just want it to work.
Optional. Yes.
They just want it to work.
True. Yeah.
Yes.
One thing though, as a specific example of what I'm talking about with the mayors is everyone knows she's been very outspoken about it. Mayor Gondek has what I would describe as a very radical environmental policy, which would seem to run headlong into the reality that oil and gas is the most vital industry to our province. And we have a mayor who says she wants to get rid of 60% of the cars in the city of Calgary within the foreseeable future. How do you bridge something like that? How do you find compromise there? That seems to be a tough one.
I think the problem always is that if you try to centrally plan your way into a solution, you're not going to end up with the right solutions. And so I'm about how do we enable the market to move in the direction the market wants to move? And where the market wants to move in this province is a hydrogen economy. You're already seeing an immense amount of investment happening in the Edmonton area through Edmonton Global. They're acting as a regional development arm. You've got Air Products that's going to have a net zero hydrogen plant. You've got other industries like Dow Chemical wanting to do a net zero petrochemical plant. You've got the oil sands operators wanting to do net zero on bitumen. So you've already got the biggest players saying, hey, we're moving in this direction. So let's work with that. Now, what would happen if we worked with a hydrogen economy? Well, a couple things would happen. Number one, why are we waiting for Ontario to start establishing a hydrogen auto plant? Why don't we have one here? If this is going to be the hub of the hydrogen economy, shouldn't we have the hydrogen trucks and the hydrogen cars and the hydrogen engines built in our province? Because we then would be the feeder to British Columbia, to California, to Texas. There's an enormous market here. There's a difference once you hit Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay and East, especially Ontario and Quebec, not as much in the Maritimes, they're electricity based. Their electrical grid is built on nuclear and hydroelectric power. They're going to have a totally different approach than we do. And hydrogen vehicles are also net zero vehicles. So why don't we say, let's put it in the positive, that by 2035, we want to have 60% of the vehicles on the road being hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And to enable that, we've got to amp up production here. The only way we can do that is if we repatriate the manufacturing and all the auto parts, and we become a hub for that here. Let's work with our agriculture community to see if we can find a way to get hydrogen engines in all the agriculture equipment. Let's make sure that we've got fueling stations in all of our major centers so that our long haul truckers can already start transitioning their engines over to hydrogen engines. That to me is a practical way of approaching it. And then you start measuring what the outcome would be. So I think hydrogen is going to be absolutely enormous. We already have the expertise in being able to develop it, sequester it, move it, and transport it, and use it for fuel. So let's build on that. The other side of it too is, frankly, on bitumen. I when I was at Alberta Enterprise Group, which was the last business advocacy role I had, I met a company called Wapaki that wants to have non-combustion bitumen. When you think about what bitumen has been used for historically, and is still used for today largely, is asphalt. So regardless of whether you're driving your zero emission electric vehicle or your zero emission hydrogen vehicle, you're still going to need roads for them to drive on. So that allows for us to use our bitumen for a higher value purpose. There's another company called C6 that has a process where they take the CO2, embed it in the bitumen as they're developing and taking out the fines, and they are going to use it for carbon nanotubes. Well, carbon nanotubes can be used as a new construction material that rivals steel and is probably actually better than steel. So why don't we create an entire industry in Alberta where we're manufacturing a base construction material that can replace the steel that we're importing from China? When I look at these kinds of things, then layer on top of that, a lot of the oil sands operators want to start using small modular nuclear reactors instead of natural gas, which will further lower their greenhouse gas footprint. But I found out last week that because Ottawa won't let us develop our own power plants less than 200 megawatts or greater than 200 megawatts, it means that Ottawa is going to have the approval process for that, which is going to add an extra 10 years to the process. So these are the reasons we've got to fight back, is that our industry is looking for solutions and Ottawa keeps on standing in the way. So I believe that, and I haven't even talked about all the uses for CO2 that I'm seeing to create cement, to create industrial minerals that can turn into soap, to create plastics, to create alcohol. What I'm seeing is an explosion of innovation. And if we work with our entrepreneurs, we will achieve the outcome that the mayor and others want, but we'll do it in a way that they probably haven't thought of yet. So I'm pretty excited about being able to sell that message to the world, because boy, if we can elevate what we're using for hydrogen, we're a natural gas basin, that will also increase our royalties. If we increase our use of bitumen because we're able to use it for construction materials and asphalt, that will also increase our royalties. Now we have money to be able to pay off our debt, put into a savings account, make sure that we can transform our healthcare system as our aging population goes through it, make sure that we can make sure our kids get educated in the best way that they possibly can, start reinvesting in trades. Like, I just see a future that is so bright for Alberta if we make the right choices here. And if we allow Ottawa to continue to put their thumb on us, it could all be for naught. So we've got to start acting now. We've got to start pushing back now.
Okay, that sounds great. So let's switch the page a little bit from economics and maybe talk a little bit about values. So I read recently in 2015, during the 2015 campaign, Stephen Harper said something that was very prescient. He said that if Justin Trudeau was elected, he's going to spend a lot of money basically promoting leftist ideology. And lo and behold, this is what has happened. And so we have, in Canada, we might have the wokest government in the Western world, this wokeness, which incorporates a lot of things. It's a kind of a catch-all that describes a certain worldview, which is very, very non-conservative. And you happen to be seeking the leadership of a party that has conservative in the name. In terms of your values on economics, it's clear that you're squarely within the realm of what we would call conservative. But then when we turn to values, I've read that, for example, that you're pro-choice, that you're supportive of, for example, the LGBTQ plus agenda and so on. But as premier, would you be concerned about the level or the prevalence of this woke ideology, specifically in things like education? And then let me give you an example. Right now in Canada, actually in British Columbia, there's a lawyer who's being disciplined because he did not use the chosen pronoun of another lawyer in court. And many listeners may not realize this, but in British Columbia, you must announce your pronouns in order to address the court. There are a group of boys in middle school in Ontario who are under suspension and actually facing criminal prosecution for the same reason, that they did harm. So that the failure to use chosen pronouns constitutes an assault in law. So this seems to be this wokeness being taken to a very dangerous extreme. So if you are, and I hate to put labels on people, because I mean nobody's purely this or that, but let's say if we could describe you as a libertarian in terms of your values, are you concerned about some of the things that are being taught in Alberta schools, for example, about gender fluidity? Are you concerned about things like drag queen story hour in schools, things that are very controversial in places like Florida and Texas and elsewhere? Where are you at in terms of these, let's call it values?
I used to ask double-barreled questions. You ask like triple and quintuple-barreled questions.
You don't have to. You're not in court, so you can sidestep them. Hinshaw was very good at sidestepping a lot of my questions.
I'll try not to. I do try to answer directly. So I call myself a libertarian conservative because, and Preston Manning, I got to interview him for his book, Do Something, last year, and it was amazing. We got 6 hours together.
Great book.
But one of the things that he talked about is this. We always talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. I would just add it's the Socratic Judeo-Christian tradition. So Socrates' view was know thyself, and that's really important. Like you have to. That's why I think I'm a libertarian. As it begins with, who are you? What are your values? Why do you make the decisions that you do? Second step is control thyself. That's sort of the Mosaic, the Moses, the Judaic law about you have to exercise discipline, and there's a lot of rules in the Judaic code about food and so on and so forth. Much of those are supposed to apply to the priest, as I understand it, but the notion is the same. Is that you've got to have a level of self-discipline in your own life, so because you make better decisions when you're not drug addicted, when you're able to get up for work in the morning, when you have a life partner that you have committed to and you're working together towards common goals. Like there's just certain things that it's not an everything goes. And then there's a give thyself, because once you know thyself, you've controlled yourself and you're successful, you are going to have the ability and capacity to give back to your community. So I would say that that's why I kind of bridge the libertarian and conservative divide. I'm not really in my own personal life an anything goes type of person. I live quite conservatively by quite conservative values. That being said, I also recognize that this wokeism comes from somewhere, and it means that there are some adults and some parents who want their kids to be taught in that kind of environment. But just because some parents want that doesn't mean it should be imposed on all parents. So we need to have the ability to have more parents choose the type of school environment that they want to be in. And one of the things that you begin that with, I think, is the micro school movement in the US is something I'm quite interested in, because my grandmother came out from New Brunswick teaching at a one-room schoolhouse. And now we've got, especially 2 years worth of experience with online learning. You actually could have a teacher-led micro school where a teacher decides, I'm going to set up a one-room schoolhouse and I want to attract kids to come here. And then you have the funding follow them, so that if you give $10,000, instead of giving it to a school board, you give it to the parent, and then the parent can take it to that school. Then the teacher can choose to have 10 kids or 20 kids or 30 kids and create the environment that they want. But importantly, the teacher gets to teach the kind of things they want in the way they do. The parents get to choose the kind of things that get taught in that school. And I think it creates a little bit of a counterbalance. That's what I think is missing right now, is that nobody has the ability to say, I just want my kids to learn reading and to do math and to have learning comprehension and to be able to write and to be able to do programming. And maybe we can save some of the sexuality until they're a little bit older. I mean, I was a late bloomer. I didn't have a boyfriend until I was in grade 12. I mean, why do we feel like all of this sexuality needs to be taught to kids at such a young age? If parents want a more age appropriate introduction of some of those concepts, why aren't they being allowed to have that? That's how I'm looking at this issue. Some parents want it at the earliest stages, and fair enough if that's what they want to do, but we're not allowing for diversity. And that's the real problem that I see. Personally, I have a number of transgender listeners when I was on the air. And so one of the things that I think is a real problem for the transgender community is that they're trying to get medical care. And so this is, I think, part of what's happened is because they want to be able to get services across the full range to help them as they're doing their transition. I think they're trying to get a general acceptance or general understanding of what some of the issues are. I wonder if one of the issues that was raised with me was trying to get a transgender or a doctor who could specialize in transgender medicine. Why don't we allow for a portal so that those doctors who specialize in it are up online, and then people would be able to get connected with the doctors the same way that we approach medical assistance in dying? Why don't we do the same thing? Like, rather than make it mandatory across all education programs, why don't we allow for those who need to have that training and want to be able to provide that service to be able to get the education they need and register online so that you can match patients with doctors? That would be one area. Dealing with some of the other controversial issues as well for women who want to get RU 488, 486, or the morning after pill. I think that's one of the areas where people are concerned that doctors are being forced to prescribe what they against their values. Well, why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we put online doctors that are willing to prescribe it, and then you can match the patients who want that service with the doctors willing to give it? It does seem to me like we're not being very strategic or very targeted in trying to do this matching. We're bullying and making people believe they all have to believe the same thing, and that's what is causing the division. I think that there's a way to honor and respect our friends in religious communities and the teaching community, and still be able to provide the kind of care and support for those who are on the other side of the spectrum without violating either side. Those are the kind of solutions that I would be looking for. I don't know if I answered all of the questions that you have, but I just wanted to tell you sort of my basic framework and tell you how I would look for solutions. But we have to make sure. I know how I feel and how I felt when I was on the air, when I was being asked to put forward a narrative that violated my foundational beliefs and my conscience. I couldn't sleep at night. So if that's how I felt just covering COVID, I can only imagine how somebody would feel when it goes so foundationally to issues of what they believe from Scripture. We can't force people to do that. People live in, and I think you've mentioned Jordan Peterson when we were talking earlier. He talked about in his book 12 Rules for Life. That just creates such a fundamental break for people spiritually. You have to have integrity. You have to be able to live your life that's consistent with your values. And I don't know if everybody appreciates just how important that is. It really is important. You can't anyway, you know it because you're a lawyer. So
I agree. I agree. And what I'm hearing is I think we share the same definition of democracy, and that is a democracy should be ruled by the majority, but with respect for minority rights. I think part of what wokeness is doing, or what it's causing, or the tension it's causing, is many people have the impression that perhaps we're becoming a victimhood culture where these minorities, for example, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, he came to prominence, as you know, because he objected to federal legislation which compelled speech, compelled the use of these pronouns. Incidentally, there's a great book that you might have read by Ben Shapiro, who apparently is one of your colleagues on the dark web. That's on your Wikipedia bio, by the way.
Am I on the dark web? I didn't know that I was on the dark web.
Apparently, you are part of something called locals.com.
Oh, is that the dark web?
With such ne'er-do-wells as Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Ben Shapiro, all of whom are people I regard as
true.
Brilliant.
Guilty. I am on Locals.
Yeah, okay, so you're good company. But Ben Shapiro, one of the people on that list, wrote a wonderful book. It came out a couple of years ago. It's called The Right Side of History. And that book is about what you just described, where Western culture is sort of this, it's this inherited tradition that comes from the Judeo-Christian morality and also the ancient Greeks and reason and logic through the Enlightenment. And part of what people like me are concerned about is, it's important to recognize the individual characteristics of all Albertans. Every Albertan needs to be respected. However, there is this inheritance of Western culture, which is really, really important. It's what's made us different. And people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and the other gang you hang out with, they all think this is really important. It's something we need to carry on. In fact, Dr. Roger Scruton described this as the definition of conservatism. That is, whatever is beautiful about our culture, we pass it on. It's what we would pass on to the future. And I think part of the tension here is, okay, how do we adapt this inheritance of Western culture, which can at times be insensitive to minorities, but hold on to that and keep that as valuable and pass that on to our children or grandchildren, while also adapting to the challenges of, people who have different lifestyles and have different values that come into conflict with that. It sounds to me like that's something that you're sensitive to, which is encouraging, because someone like Justin Trudeau is not. People like that just think that we should just wash away and forget about Shakespeare and Mozart, and we should topple statues of Sir Winston Churchill. And I just think that is wrong-headed and dangerous. Would you agree?
I've often challenged my social conservative friends to have sort of a broader view of who can be a part of our coalition. I mean, part of the reason why I supported gay marriage, for instance, was for conservative reasons, is that I believe everyone needs a life mate, that our life mate and the person we partner with is the person who we're going to grow old with, who's going to see us through thick and thin, who's going to be holding our hands when we die. And I don't really care whether that person is the same gender or the opposite gender. I just think that it's good for humanity for us to pair bond like that. And so that's why I've sort of framed my support of LGBTQ rights in the context of my conservative values. Increasingly as well, once couples form that pair bond, they want to have children, and children is families are a foundation building block of society, and so we have to do whatever we can to keep families intact. So I think my view perhaps is broader than many social conservatives, because I have also seen that some religions were the first to validate gay marriages, like United and Unitarian and some Anglican. And so I've kind of embraced a bit of a broader view, where I don't think libertarian and social conservatism and LGBTQ rights are in conflict. That being said, certainly is always an extremist group in any kind of ideology that will not be consistent with our libertarian conservative values. And so I think we partner with those who share the same things we do and the same aspirations that we do. And we try to create a welcoming environment. I mean, let's face it, Jesus talked about adultery several hundred times in the New Testament. And yet you don't have church groups every time saying you adulterers are going to be sinners and you're going to go to hell. If you did that, there'd be a lot of the congregation who'd feel a little alienated by that, because there's a lot of us who have been divorced and remarried. And so if there's sort of a broader view that we can take of trying to be embracing of people who share this notion of wanting to live a conservative lifestyle and marry and have kids and be just good people, then that should be irrelevant what their sexual orientation is. That's maybe where I differ, I think, with some of my social conservative friends. But it comes from a place, I think, of just wanting people to create and make choices that are really going to enhance who they are as an individual. That I have my first husband, speaking of adultery, my first husband was, he always used to say that he had his 4 rules for life, like get up in the morning, go to work and get there on time, don't get indebted, and don't have a child out of wedlock. And those are sort of like his kind of basics for a good life, to make sure that if you follow those rules, things would generally work out pretty well for you. And I don't think that those are really, those are pretty conservative ways of approaching it. So I try to make sure that I understand that most people do not subscribe to all of these very fancy opinions and pedagogies that are being taught in universities. I remember when I was on the air, I didn't even know what woke was. Like, think about that. I got on the air in 2015. I'd never even heard that term. And so I had to do a couple of segments because I didn't understand what it was. I didn't know what a privilege hierarchy was. No one talks that way. As for pronouns, anyone who tells me what their pronouns are, I will use them. I have a non-binary family member who's sort of working that out. And while they're working that out, I'm going to be respectful of that. I think that these are very personal family decisions. These are hard decisions these kids are making. They don't know who they are. They don't understand what's happening as they're going through puberty. They don't know why they're attracted to both boys and girls. And so they're just I think they have a lot of work that they need to do to figure that out. By the time they become adults, if we can give a supportive environment, then I think that it'll all become clear. But I don't like the fact that we've polarized the discussion so much, because I think it causes these young kids to have a bunch of adults talking about their sexuality in a way that they're confused about it too. So I would love for us to just try to depoliticize a lot of these issues and try to treat things on an individual by individual basis. People who don't have a non-binary member in their family probably won't understand what those of us who do are trying to do to be sensitive and supportive. And so that's the other part of it, maybe, is just I've had different experiences and had a very broad range of friends just because of the kind of work that I've done. So I tend to be very, very sensitive and supportive and try to see things from the perspective of the person I'm with. The real problem that we have is that I can have non-binary and transgender friends, but I can also have Christian friends too. And I recognize that there's different worldviews there. You can be friends with everybody and not agree with 100% of where they're coming from. Whereas it seems to me that our Christian friends continue to get shouted down in the public square in a way that we would never do to any other religious community. And that is something that I have always fought against.
Okay, very fair answer. So we've kept you quite a long time, been very generous with your time. Thank you for that. I saved the toughest question for the last. And I did that out of fairness to you, because I wanted to give you a full chance to tell us about your ideas before I sort of hit you with the tough one, which I'm sure you're going to be able to give a very persuasive answer to. So 10 years ago, you very nearly became the first lady premier of our province, and I was one of the people who voted for your party. I thought you would have been an excellent premier, certainly better than the lady we got. No offense to her, but I think most people would agree her premiership was not a sterling period in Alberta history. But then a couple years later, there was this incident. And so when I had put on my Facebook page, I was very excited, by the way, to have you on the program, and you haven't disappointed me at all, that I was going to have you on the program. Some haters wrote in and said, well, I would never trust her. I would never trust her because she crossed the floor, blah, blah, blah. So what do you say to those people? What do you say to these people who say, well, I will never trust her because she did X? Now, I certainly understand I understand why you did what you did. It was a question of principle. It was not the first time that you were either removed from a situation or you left a situation because the organization you were part of didn't match your principles. That's the way I read it. But what would you say to those people who you'd want to have, trust that you could be our next premier?
We thought we were merging the parties. We thought we were bringing together these two parts of the province and the conservative movement, because we had a tradition of doing that at the federal level, and we'd had a tradition of doing it historically too. And we obviously went about it the wrong way. I got punished for it. I didn't win my nomination. Jim got punished for it. He didn't win re-election. And there's still a lot of people who remain angry. I think what I'd say is, getting back into politics, though, I'm back in for the same reason, that I think unity is more important than ever. I don't know what might have happened in 2015. It may well be, having the two conservative parties split, we would have ended up with exactly the same result that we did, with Rachel Notley winning. But we know for sure that will happen now, that if we can't convince the Buffalo Party guys and the Alberta Prosperity Project guys and the Wildrose Independence guys and Todd and Brian and Drew were all thinking about starting their own parties. If we ended up having 7 different conservative parties all fighting in different ways on the same thing, that is just a recipe for Rachel Notley to win. So the world that we have to accept now is that this sort of extreme progressive vote is unified under Rachel Notley. And we've got to figure out a way to solve our divisions and to change the party from within. That I think is maybe the one of the mistakes I made. Is I had considered in 2009, when I had just had it with the direction of government and racking up debt and demonizing our energy industry, I had considered, well, can I change the party from within? And I felt like I would be better trying to change the party from outside. Now, with the benefit of the passage of time, seeing how things work out when you split a movement, I feel like we can change this party from within. If we get the right leader, and then all of those groups get active so that they can participate in the nominations, so we get the right MLAs, then we really can do everything that we need to do. I think that there's a lot more that unites us among Conservatives than divides us. And I mean, I've apologized for the mistake of the time, but it came from the right reason, which is I think we need unity, and if we're going to need unity if we're going to take on this battle. Our battle's not with each other as Albertans. Our first battle is with Justin Trudeau, and if we do not have a strong group of people to challenge Justin Trudeau, and we end up with Trudeau Singh running federally, and you've got a Rachel Notley premier, and you've got two of the most progressive mayors in Calgary and Edmonton, this place won't be the same in 10 years. We may never get back the kind of culture that we were talking about. So this is a really important leadership race, and it's a really important general election coming up. And I felt like by getting back in now, that I could be demonstrating just through my actions that I still believe unity is important and it's the right thing. And I hope people will agree that that's the case, especially since the consequences of losing are just so dire.
Well, for what it's worth, I really can't understand this whole distrust argument, because what I see is a person who has honesty. That's something that is very persuasive to me. Secondly, I see courage. And then there's also wisdom. I mean, the fact that you would risk, coming back in and put your reputation on the line, and put yourself in a situation where you would suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in the political arena. Yeah, exactly. But to me, that makes it that makes you a more compelling candidate than you were in 2012. I mean, you're 10 years older, 10 years smarter, 10 years braver. So I guess I'm giving away my vote here, but it's not just because you came on the program. Although that won you a lot of points with me.
Well, thank you for the work that you've done as well. I think that you really exposed a lot about how decision making was made during COVID that we've got to correct also. We didn't get too much into it. But if we have a group of people who believe they did nothing wrong and they do everything the same way, that's another real danger spot. That if we get into the fall respiratory virus season and the same forces come to bear, we've got to be able to have someone who's going to say we can do something differently. We've got to stand against that.
Yes, we can agree there. It sounds like we agree on a lot of points. And again, very, very grateful for your time and your honesty, and for sharing your mind, your vision for Alberta, which to me is a very compelling one. We're at the part of the program where we go to what I call the reading list. And this is where we try to provide the people who are consuming the podcast with a place or places where they can go to further their understanding of the topic, the things that we've been talking about. So I'm going to go first, and I'm going to let you finish off the program. I'm going to come back to one of the people who you've said has influenced you. He's written many books, but the one that I've chosen is by Tom Flanagan. It's called Winning Power: Canadian Campaigning in the 21st Century. And the reason why I've chosen is because you're in it. It's about campaigning, and the description here is that campaigns are central to the practice of modern democracy and integral to political participation in the 21st century. And winning power, Tom Flanagan draws on decades of experience teaching political science and managing political campaigns to inform readers about what goes on behind the scenes. And part of what he talks about in the book is the campaign with the Wildrose Party in 2012. And so I thought that might be fascinating for our readers, not only because, of course, Tom Flanagan is a great writer, but also they'd have an opportunity to learn more about you and your politics and your history and where you're from and what you're all about. So do you have any ideas, any suggestions for people? It doesn't have to be a book. It might be a website or an essay or something like that you can point them to? Old episodes of your show?
A couple of things I would. Well, they should go on to my locals, daniellesmith.locals.com. You can register. You don't have to pay. If you want to, the way the site works is that they don't want a bunch of anonymous trolls on there. So the only way you can post is if you pay a small subscription, but you can go on and register and monitor anything that you want. But to me, that has been my lifeline for finding good information. I would say Matthias Desmond, who's done so much work on mass formation and this sort of mass psychosis that we're in. I think that's really important for people to understand as they're confronting friends who are still kind of caught up in the hysteria around COVID. There's a lot of deprogramming we need to do, and that might be helpful. I've also read Bigley, which is Scott Adams' book. He's a really interesting guy because he's the Dilbert cartoonist, and he's a registered Democrat, but he actually voted for Trump. And so that's a really interesting example of somebody from the left who is now coming over to understand why some of our ideas on the conservative side of the spectrum are the right ones. Those are really interesting books to read. And then, of course, I mentioned it earlier, but Do Something. It is Preston Manning's latest book. He's got 365 ways on 365 days that you can advance the conservative movement. I'm working through every single one of them. I'm trying to do as much as I can to push our ideas and our movement forward. And if everybody did the same thing, we can change this place. We can change the country.
He's actually written recently an essay. It's a thought experiment where I think it's called the COVID Report. If people are interested can find this. It's on the Frontier Center for Public Policy website. I actually wrote a commentary on it. Basically what it is a thought experiment where Mr. Manning imagines a privately crowdfunded public inquiry which examines 16 focal questions, fundamental questions about how the federal government handled or mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's starting to gather some traction, as most of his ideas do. But I don't know if you've had a chance to read that. But
I've had a chance to talk to him about it, and I think he's right. What I don't want to see is the kind of public inquiry where we normally do, where we hire a legal firm and give them a bunch of money, and they go and write a 700-page report.
No.
If we're gonna do this, let's do it right. Let's do it through open congressional style hearings where you've got multi-party, you call your witnesses, you televise it on all of the social media platforms, you make it available at a time that most people want to watch it, and you actually help to educate people through the process. I don't think it needs to be a witch hunt, but it does need to be we can't do this to people again. And so what are the key decision points that we could do differently next time? I'd be 100% in favor of that.
One of the great things about Mr. Manning's politics that sounds like from listening to you today that you agree with it is that everything he talks about is grassroots. And that's really what that book you pointed us to is about. It's about, we don't just have to, politics doesn't have to be a spectator sport. There's things you can do in your own life. You can really make a difference. And that's what I love about a lot of what Mr. Manning talks about in his writings. But Danielle, again, thank you so much for being with us here today. We've learned a lot about you. I think that we've had a meaningful discussion, and I hope that anybody who's listened to this is an understanding that you are a person who is so well qualified to be our next premier. And I want to wish you much success in your campaign.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. We'll talk again.
Okay. Take care.
Bye now.